reasonably sure that since the commission was created by Congress, it would probably be somewhat difficult to extend it by executive order. So I think we should go on the basis that it is only going to be with us for another 2 years. This 3-day symposium results from combining the major themes of two of the sponsoring organizations for this year. The American Society for Public Administration adopted as its goal for the year the establishment of a greater interrelationship between the nation's universities and the various levels of government in the United States. The Alaska Humanities Forum, who provided a grant to fund portions of this symposium, has had as its theme for the past 2 years, Land, a Bridge to Community. Here in Anchorage, there are several dialogues underway on urban planning and other land planning needs as a result of Humanities Forum grants. There will be one on Thursday night, Thursday afternoon, and Thursday evening, sponsored by the Greater Anchorage Area Borough and the Humanities Forum, dealing with some of our urban planning problems. In discussing our chapter goals for the year, it became apparent to the Southcentral chapter of ASPA that the coordination of the activities of land managers was a subject which had been often talked about, which has so far resulted in little dialogue addressed to the establishment of real joint management goals. We realized that the precedent had been set by many joint management operations presently underway between federal, state, and local governments, and these will, I hope, be brought out during our discussion here, and the discussion will include their merits as well as their faults. Now, the Joint Federal State Land Use Planning Commission for Alaska has established recommendations, as we all know, for the use of Alaska's D2 lands. These recommendations had no suggestions for management forwarded with them. When the Department of Interior made recommendations to the Congress for federal management systems on these lands, it occasioned the recent debate which has occurred throughout the state in past months. Overlooked in all the rhetoric about the D2 lands and their ultimate managers has been the other 292 million acres of land in Alaska and the management systems which will govern its use. There will be more than 42 million acres of private land, most in the ownership of Alaska Natives. There will be 103 million acres of state land, which has had no serious scenarios yet written or released to the public about the ultimate use and management for the great bulk of it. Only the provisions governing allotment of borough lands from the state holdings provide a system to which other managers can relate at this moment. There will still remain some 230 million acres of federal land. This will include 130 million acres presently existing in or designated for the 4 systems outlined in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, being the national parks, the national forests, the wildlife refuges, and the wild and scenic rivers. There are also some 26 million acres in Department of Defense withdrawals, including Naval Petroleum Reserve 4. There are power sites which overlap in general other designations and which I have not taken the time to isolate. In any case, there remains some 74 million acres of undesignated federal land, large parts of which are open to entry for homesteaders, trade and manufacturing, and other uses. Now, these open to entry lands are already beginning to channel development in the state and to create problems because that development is unrelated to other nearby land uses. Guides are setting up camps in historic native hunting and fishing areas. Homesteads are being staked out in prime mining country. These may or may not be desirable as they relate to local, state, and national goals. However, such utilization of the land is going on at present, and all the dollars we are pouring into land management may be compromised because of it. Obviously, we cannot wait forever for an ultimate system of land management, but we need not let the opportunity to do the job better go by default. Our symposium is structured so that the panels are a blend of university people, federal, state, and local land managers, and representatives of private interests. The first 4 panels relate to the functional management of land in major areas of concern in Alaska. It is certainly not intended that these are the only functional areas which apply in Alaska. but they will encompass most uses of the land outside of urban areas. The coastal zone and the relationship of marine and terrestrial management systems has been somewhat slighted in this symposium, and this will be the theme of an ASPA seminar to be held on May 25th of this year. This symposium is our chapter's main effort for the year, but it is a part of a continuing series of seminars sponsored by ASPA throughout the winter. 2 have been held, and 2 more will follow. They're all held on Saturdays and have got a surprisingly good turnout, considering the fact that the weather has been very good on both Saturdays of the 2 ones that have already been held. 2 more are to follow. The next on March 30th will feature Bush government, and that will be followed by the one previously referred to in May on coastal zone management. We chose our 4 functional areas of land management for several reasons, but chief among them would be because our first panel, which you'll hear shortly, covers watershed management, which is the base, of course, of human life and development. And this has been so since man first began to practice agriculture and was thus able to begin to live in settlements and eventually urbanize. Our second panel concerns Alaska's fish and game, probably the dearest priority of her citizens after their families and jobs. When the long-term residents articulate their reasons for choosing Alaska as their permanent residence, they usually say it as the land itself. And I think most people view the fish and game as an integral part of the land. If the living resources are gone, certainly the land has a sterility and no longer has the same enchantment for most. And the topic of the third panel, recreation, is something which, because of the increasing attraction of Alaska for other Americans and foreign visitors, may become the most devastating land use of all. Wisely managed, however, it can be the greatest boon which this state can offer to the nation. And then, of course, our last functional panel, natural resources, have occasioned the great debates of the last 5 years over oil, timber, and mining development. Here I hope it can be reduced to its proper perspective as another use of land, which in some cases may be the least destructive of other values. Our final 2 panels on Wednesday will hopefully build on what transpires today and tomorrow and provide some better guidance in land management philosophies and in the legal and political relationships affecting cooperative management systems. When the American Society for Public Administration established its goal of greater interrelationship between the universities and government, a task force was formed to further that goal under the chairmanship of the Society's president-elect, Philip Rutledge. We're honored to have Mr. Rutledge present during this symposium. He will be the speaker at our banquet tomorrow night, Tuesday, where his subject will be the policymaker versus the program manager, a theme which will probably arise several times during our discussions here. And I would like to ask Mr. Rutledge to say a few words about his task force at this time. Phil?
Thank you very much, Walt, and members and friends of the American Society for Public Administration. Let me say first that I am very pleased to have this opportunity to visit the Southcentral Alaska chapter. It not only gave me an opportunity to visit Alaska for the first time, but also for the first time in a long while to find a place where there were no long gasoline lines and no limitations on the amount that one could purchase. Too bad I can't bring my car with me to fill up on the way back. I am also, though, particularly pleased that this symposium, which you are having now, is an expression of the kind of thing that we hope many more of our chapters around the nation will become involved in. Some of us who have watched the development of our profession have recognized that the university that has, of course, many functions, but among which have been the preparation of the leadership, the preparation of the professional staffs for the governmental side of our public enterprise, and those who are managing those enterprises are seldom engaged in the kinds of dialogues that many in the profession feel would be helpful. And there has not been, on the scale that we would like to see it, an understanding of each other's mutual concerns in the development of the kind of support that would be very healthy for the society to have. So about 2 years ago, your immediate past president, John Ryan, who president of the University of Indiana, pulled together a group to discuss how we might proceed to improve this relationship. This led to the establishment last year of the Joint Task Force on Interrelating the Needs of Government and Higher Education, a task force which is made up really of 3 separate groups. One of the groups is an integral committee of the society itself, a committee on government and university relationships, but also it's made up of representatives from similar groups from the National Association of Schools of Public Affairs and Administration, some representatives of the Academy for Public Administration, and other representatives. And we have been engaged in not only stimulating dialogue, but working from a 3-pronged thrust. One, headed by George Frederickson of the University of Indiana, which is attempting to ask the local chapters around the country to take a look at the relationships between governments and higher education and needs, a kind of a marketing survey that seeks opportunities to be a greater service and to report back what that agenda should be. And we've asked chapters to participate in this survey, and we're very pleased that the Southcentral Alaska chapter is among those that are participating. We have also another group under the chairmanship of Leo Herbert of the Governmental Accounting Office that is looking at the very serious question of communication, and another group under the chairmanship of Brust of the University of Washington that is looking at the very important phase of finance. And in this process, we hope to move the discussion and the mutual support to a higher level and really a much broader level. Because as important as the professional development function is, and the professional development of the public administrator is one of the key goals that the society has established for itself to push over the next few years. As important as that is, there are other areas of the relationship which also require attention. We have long recognized that those of us who move into public administration generally get there by accident. Most of us, like myself, are trained in other professions or disciplines or something that we would consider a primary profession. And somehow, at some point, the kinds of management we're doing relates less to our original discipline and more toward the management of complex systems that not only relate to our own primary professional discipline, but relates to everything else. And we begin to think of ourselves in self-consciously as a public administrator. And Harlan Cleveland, one of our recent presidents, has referred to ASPA as every man's second professional organization. It is the professional organization that one's moved toward when one becomes then self-conscious as a professional administrator. And that continuing education thrust and service and support that the university provides to the emerging self-conscious public administrator cannot be overestimated in its importance. But nevertheless, we like to see and are delighted to see chapters such as yours providing the kind of bridge and the kind of forum around which the university, the governmental community, and the public and other interested groups can work out policies and debate issues that are of central importance to the community around it. And I am, for that reason, very pleased to have an opportunity to share some parts of this symposium with you and to bring to you also the greetings and best wishes from your President Frank Sherwood, from your Executive Director, Seymour Berlin, and the other members of the national staff. And I certainly will look forward during the next year, as I assume the presidency, to working much more directly with you and hopefully having an opportunity to visit with you here in Anchorage again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. That bit about doing things other than what one did 10 years ago, I think, struck home to just about everybody in this room. When our local chapter approached the universities and explained its goal for the forthcoming year, we had a most enthusiastic response. Our host here today, the University of Alaska at Anchorage, has been a tremendous support to all chapter activities for this year. Without the university's support, our ambitious program of Saturday seminars plus a symposium of this magnitude would have been impossible. I've been associated with the University of Alaska since 1946 now, and I think that the University of Alaska in Anchorage, whether as a community college or as a four-year branch, has always had a very close relationship with the community. It's always done a lot on small budgets and in cramped quarters. Its involvement in helping ASPA further its goal has been another example of furthering the concept of the university in the community. I would like to introduce the Provost of the University of Alaska for the Southcentral region, Dr. Haines, at this time.
Thank you, Walt, members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen. In an informal kind of a way, I would like to welcome you to our campus. I really would prefer to defer this official welcome to Mrs. Wolcott, who has been the spark plug for all of the programs which Walt has just explained to you. Although we are part of a statewide institution, the University of Alaska Anchorage takes considerable pride in the development of its own particular programs, and that in a way is why we are particularly pleased that you provided this opportunity for both our faculty and our students to take part. We are a young institution, and one of the programs that we're taking considerable pride in is the public administration program. And we hope that through the continued interaction with the chapter that, as I say, our faculty and our students will have an exceptional opportunity. As I said before, I would like to acknowledge the very hard work of Walt Parker, Mrs. Wolcott, others, I'm sure. We've enjoyed a very close relationship, and in a small way, we've had our own interesting development of land use, and I think here is a prime example of the location of the consortium library. As the program continues, I wish you would feel free to call upon members of our staff here at the university to provide you with whatever kind of service you would like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou. Our first panel on watershed management will now begin. It is interesting that the moderator of this panel is also the editor of a recent publication entitled The Atna Region. In that publication, I found the following message, which I think sums up beautifully the reason for this symposium. Who is going to coordinate the development of an integrated, responsive land use and management system? How are land uses and controls going to be developed in the future? Which authorities will guide and assist the planning efforts of the region? Will the federal and state governments provide assistance to the private landowners in the development of regulations and controls leading to land development and management? Can the people of the area disregard the need for land use controls and management, allowing unplanned growth to continue to the detriment of the region's economic well-being? I would like to introduce my colleague at the University of Alaska's Environmental Information and Data Center, a member of the Anchorage Borough's Planning and Zoning Commission, the president of the Planning Association of Alaska, and a delightful lady and a very good friend, Dr. Lidia Selkregg.
Thank you. Good morning. After this introduction, I feel very humble. First, I'd like to introduce the panel that is here and will present all their knowledge to you this morning. And from my left, there is Mr. The Honorable Jack Roderick, with the mayor of the Greater Anchorage Area Borough. And next to him is Stanley Brust, the Federal Activity Coordinator for Alaska Operation Office of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Then Mason Wade, Chief Flood Plain Management Planning Report Branch of the U.S. Corps of Engineers. The Honorable Max Brewer, with the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation for the state of Alaska. And next to him is Kurt McVee, which is the State Director of the Bureau of Land Management of the U.S. Department of the Interior, and Chet Zenon for the Alaska which represent the Alaska Conservation Society, but also is, can I say, a staff member of the USGS. So today, though, he will have a hat representing the Alaska Conservation Society. And Herman Veselka, Public Works Director for the City of Anchorage, represent, I presume, the Mayor of Anchorage. When Walt asked me to chair this panel, I thought really that the coordinator should probably say, just didn't say anything, but I couldn't really, and I started searching some thoughts that I'd like to share with you this morning as a preliminary and set up the scene for this whole 3-day seminar, and I hope you let me do so and you indulge your patience from the panel. The first thought was that I am a member of the subcommittee to the State Federal Advisory Committee to the State Federal Land Use Commission, and I know the great concern of the Commission in regard of sending to Congress not only recommendation on the land use pattern that the state will have after the land selection is completed, but also the management system, which will guide and control those lands. And I think that the Commission in the next year and a half would like to arrive some innovative ideas in regard to land management. Therefore, I hope that this group today will provide some, at least some thoughts, not maybe on all the problem that we may solve, but at least guideline to the Commission on some of the issues that they must evaluate and some of the recommendations that they must make to Congress in regard to management as well as land uses. And I have brought a map to refresh everybody's memory. I know everybody's familiar with the land status map of Alaska, but I think everybody should look at during this 3-day seminar to see the tremendous task and the tremendous problem that will exist in the future when all this ownership will try to be reconciled in regard to land uses and management. The State Federal Land Use Commission has a resource planning team, which are presently studying the resources of the state, following actually boundary, which represent hydrographic units. They have divided the state in six units, and this information will be available to the various agencies to review and study, so that everybody will have the same database, I hope, when management of land is considered. The University of Alaska, through my office, is preparing a summary of data, which will be presented in 6 profiles, physical profiles of the state, which will have the data as prepared by the State Federal Land Use Commission, summarized and presented in the same mode that it was presented in the Greater Anchorage Area Borough Environmental Atlas. The hope is that maybe by next year, we can all look at the same database when we talk about management and when we talk about land uses. At this moment, all of us in this room may have different ideas in regard of what we consider a use of land or a management of land. The concern of man in regard to management of watershed or management of land is not new. In fact, when I was searching for some thoughts, I went back to the Water Yearbook of Agriculture in 1955. And I'd like to read to you just a few thoughts. Near as old as the hill themselves is the thought that condition on the hill influence stream flow, erosion, and sedimentation. The ancient Chinese had a proverb, to rule the mountains is to rule the river. No doubt that it was rooted deep in the center of Chinese experiences, but the Chinese did little about it. Vast mountains here in China are now a total waste, and rivers are choked with sediment caused by the destructive force of water in the watersheds. The Greek philosopher Plato, about 400 BC, spoke out with the clarity of modern conservationists. There are mountains in Attica which can now keep nothing but bees, but which were clothed not so very long ago with fine trees producing timber suitable for roofing the largest building, and roofs hewn from this timber are still in existence. There were also many lofty cultivated trees, while the country produced boundless pasture for cattle. The annual supply of rainfall was not lost, as it is at present, through being allowed to flow over a denuded surface to the sea, but was received by the country in all its abundance, stored in impervious patio earth, and so was able to discharge the drainage of the heights into the hollow in the form of springs and river, with an abundant volume and wide territorial distribution. The shrines that survive to the present day on the site of existing water supply are evidence for the correctness of my present hypothesis. In America, I think the concern on protection of watershed is long, and legislation has been passed in the last 100 years to provide for protection of watershed. And reviewing briefly some of the history of the law and the concern of the country, I came out with some specific date which I'd like to share with you. In 1867, a commission was established by the Wisconsin state legislature to study the relationship between forest cover and stream flow. 1872, a New York State Commission investigated the desirability of maintaining the forest for the purpose of for the protection of the Hudson and other river and the Erie Canal. In 1874, the AAAS sent to Congress a memorial which directed attention to the drying up of rivulets and growing tendency to flood and drought. 1886, the American Forestry Congress adopted a resolution directing attention to the value of public lands at the source of the stream in the preservation of water supply, and urging that those lands be kept for public use as to maintain and preserve a full supply of water in our river and stream. 1897, Congress, in enacting the Organic Administration Act for National Forest, established as one of the principal purpose of such forests the securing of favorable condition of water flows. During the 30s and the 40s, there were tremendous push for reclamation problem, and most of the attention was directed not only to the large watershed, but also to the minor water basin and watershed in response to the growing expansion of municipalities and the problem created by farming and increased poor farming management. In 1935, the Soil Conservation Service was established as a tool to preserve land and water. In 1933, the Tennessee Valley Authority was created to develop an integrated rivers basin resources development program. 1936, the Flood Control Act was enacted, and it recognized watershed treatment as the counterpart and complement to downstream flow control. In 1948, Congress passed the Water Control Pollution Act, which was amended in 56, 61, 65, 66, and 72. 1954, the 83rd Congress passed the Watershed Protection and Flood Protection Act. 1964, Water Resources Research Act. 1965, Water Resource Planning Act. 1966, Clear Water Restoration Act. Federal Water Pollution, 1966, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. In 1969, National Environmental Policy Act. In 1972, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. So what we can say here this morning, what is new? And I think what is new is that all these law and regulation passed by Congress and administered by various agencies have not found a way to be coordinated and interrelated to provide for a coordinated management system which can do something better and provide for better management of the land of what Plato was talking about for 100 years BC. And I do hope that this morning with our panel presentation, and I do with input from the audience, and I do hope that the audience will participate. I see in the audience many people. I had a little list that I lost. But anyhow, I see Harry Holsing with USGS, and I hope this panel without, I think, the Water Resources branch of the USGS may have a missing link, so I hope that Harry will participate and ask some questions. I see Ted Smith with the State Park Service, Mary Patman with the City of Anchorage Park and Recreation Department, one of our legislator, Joe Orsini, and I'm very pleased to see him here because he represents my district. And I think some of the thoughts that are expressed today may be translated into law, so I welcome his presence. And many, many other people in this room that I hope will participate and ask questions. And I hope that together we may find some answer which can be forwarded to the Commission so that the Commission, besides giving recommendation on land use, may give recommendation on management. With this, we'll start with our first panelist. And I think the first to speak is Stanley Brust with the Federal Activity Coordinator with the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you, Dr. Selkregg. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists. After that list of laws that you just read off, I think you've already taken half of my talk, but I'll try and describe EPA's function in the role of watershed management as explicitly as I can. EPA is a many-headed monster. I use the term monster figuratively here. We operate in four main categories as far as watershed management is concerned. We have regulatory functions, research functions. We provide technical assistance to federal agencies as well as state and local agencies, and we also provide financial assistance to state and local agencies. Our major regulatory function involves the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is authorized by the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. Under this law, EPA is required to issue permits for all discharges of industrial and domestic pollutants, sewage, if you will. In Alaska, we're right in the middle of this process now, and I think we'll probably have issued by the end of this year, which is our deadline, close to 300 permits. We expect that this particular part of the act will significantly contribute to the elimination of pollution to watersheds in Alaska. We also have recently promulgated regulations for oil pollution prevention, which require any person, firm, or governmental entity who stores a significant amount of oil to submit a spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plan, shortened SPCC, to EPA, and to bring their storage facilities up to standards. We also expect that this particular regulation will do quite a lot to get rid of any oil pollution. The degradation of a watershed by improper solid waste disposal practices is a fairly common occurrence. EPA has issued preliminary guidelines to federal agencies which, considering the extent of federally owned lands here in Alaska, should have a significant impact on watershed degradation by solid waste. The use of pesticides in watersheds is another fairly common occurrence here in Alaska as well. Under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, EPA is required to register and regulate the use of all pesticides used in the United States. Any improper use of such pesticides in a watershed area could result in EPA enforcement action. We also certify water supplies which serve interstate carriers. Part of our certification process includes an inspection and evaluation of a water supply system, including the source. If a watershed is improperly protected, we have the authority to prohibit the use of that water supply by interstate carriers. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency provides a significant financial contribution to Alaska. Our construction grant program provides up to 75% of the cost of sewage treatment facilities. It could be noted that the applicant for a federal construction grant is required to provide a facilities plan which normally would discuss the watershed management aspects of that particular area. Coordinated with this are EPA basin planning requirements. The basin boundaries, incidentally, are the same hydrological lines which would define the boundaries of a watershed. Other financial assistance would be state water pollution program grants provided to the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, and also special grants for sewage treatment plant operator training, and also pesticide applicator training. We have 2 grants in Alaska for solid waste management planning as well. Under Executive Order 11752, EPA is required to provide technical and administrative assistance to other federal agencies and to cooperate with state and local agencies in the prevention of pollution from federal sources. We routinely review federal agency plans for sewage treatment, solid waste disposal, oil spill prevention measures, pesticide usage, and anything else they want to talk about. We also have a continuing responsibility to review the environmental impact statements prepared by federal agencies for significant federal projects which have a potential for impacting the environment. The EPA educational program conducts classes throughout the country on specialized subjects pertaining to water pollution, air pollution, solid waste, pesticides, and environmental protection management. In addition, our technology transfer program provides the gap between research and construction of pollution control facilities. The EPA research program is centered at the Arctic Environmental Research Lab in Fairbanks. Most of the work at the lab has been chiefly devoted to research in water quality and waste treatment, and significant contributions to watershed management have come from the laboratory. At the present time, EPA is participating with other agencies, in a study of the Caribou Poker Creek's watershed management in interior Alaska. The results of this research project should have direct impact on watershed management in Alaska. The laboratory has also produced publications on the effect of forest fires on water quality in Alaska and has worked closely with the U.S. Forest Service on fertilization studies in southeast Alaska. Thank you.
I think that we go through the speakers, and then I hope there are many questions in regard to the agency activity and also
Thank you, Lydia. Speaker always looks for a profound statement to make, kind of to open things up. I think that in opening this panel that Lydia did make a couple profound ones. She did quote Plato and also from the yearbook. As you can probably suspect, my discussion will talk about watershed management in a general land management context, and I'll attempt to explore some of the philosophies of watershed management in that framework, and also talk about some of the technical implications of watershed use in that context. The role of watershed is paramount in the process of making land use decisions. The natural watershed is often utilized as a planning unit by land managers. And the example, of course, is the hydrologic unit that is being utilized in the current studies. It generally represents somewhat of a homogeneous area that is affected similarly by the hydrologic characteristics, the precipitation, stream flow, as well as soil development. Practically all uses relate to the watershed, even such extensive uses as wildlife production, because as the intensity of browsing or grazing increases, the vegetative condition of the watershed can be affected, and you can reach a point where there would be deterioration of the watershed with erosion and so on. Various recreation uses affect the watershed. Probably the most common of these is the off-road vehicles, and this has created some problems already in Alaska. As the use of watershed by people intensifies, disruption of the natural environment occurs. The construction of roads and pipelines, transmission lines, and so on increases the risks of doing damage to the natural watershed and affecting the soil and hydrologic features. The critical point being reached when erosion is accelerated, becoming irreversible by natural means, and the hydrologic equilibrium is permanently damaged. The condition of a watershed can therefore be used as an indicator of what is occurring into the natural processes. Symptoms of condition are evident through the stream flow, the water quality data, and also through erosion surveys. It is necessary to have base or benchmark studies in order to identify the natural condition of the watershed prior to imposing use. In Alaska, there is still ample opportunity to obtain this data on many watersheds. This is not true in the other states. Watersheds within the Arctic and the subarctic are particularly sensitive due to particular soil problems associated with permafrost. In addition, vegetation produces slowly due to the short growing season and, of course, the low rainfall in much of Alaska. There are some hydrologic characteristics of the Arctic watershed which we do not know a great deal about at this time, although there are current studies to improve our knowledge in these areas. Stan mentioned this. I will elaborate a little bit more upon it about the Poker Creek, Caribou Creek watershed, but this started about 5 years ago, as I recall, when the agencies that were part of the Interagency Technical Committee decided that they had to focus on some areas in the state to collect watershed information. And cooperatively, they did this, identified an area, primarily state lands, and the Coal Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory of the Corps of Engineers began monitoring these watersheds. The Weather Bureau installed precipitation gauges. SCS conducted soil mapping. The university did some vegetative mapping on this watershed. BLM provided a set of current aerial photographs. The GS provided some of the equipment for stream monitoring, and the state committed the lands to research. There are probably others involved, and I'm sure that EPA was, Alaska Power Administration, and also the research people with the Forest Service. I'm probably missing some. Example here, it is an example here, of course, of what is happening cooperatively. There's no good mechanism to do this other than a more or less informal arrangement of the Alaska Interagency Technical Committee. Currently, the Forest Service is exploring expansion of these studies together with BLM on the adjacent Washington Creek area. One of the unique characteristics of the Arctic watershed is the tundra, which covers much of Alaska. The effects of this upon the hydrologic regime has not been perfectly calculated. Another influence is the permafrost itself and the effects that this may have upon the flow of water, both over the surface as well as subsurface. We do know that there is a considerable amount of water movement through the tundra mantle itself and also at the mantle soil interface. As to what this means in quantitative terms or how it relates to proposed land use is a matter which needs further study. Due to the unique characteristics of these Arctic and subarctic watersheds, we know there's little percolation of surface moisture through the permafrost layer. Therefore, moisture not evaporated or transpired by plants is either stored within the soil or moves through the active zone, which in many cases is only 12 to 18 inches deep, or it runs off. If foreign substance are introduced from the surface, and these can be sewage or leachate from garbage pits or chemicals or oil spills or any type, we can anticipate that they will be retained in these surface soils unless they are carried immediately into the streams and rivers. With only a small volume of soil contained within the active zone, the land is less able to cope with foreign substance than if the permafrost condition did not exist. Also, the natural biologic processes which break down substances are slower in the cold climate. In the Arctic and subarctic, the land manager must be particularly sensitive to soil conditions, the type of soil, the existence of permafrost, the susceptibility of permafrost to increases in temperature, and the resource values existing upon the land. Many areas of the state, particularly in ice-rich soils, just a vehicle moving over the surface and breaking through the tundra or organic layer can upset this thermal balance and cause the permafrost to thaw. This will release water and carry soil into the adjacent streams and rivers. I might talk a little bit about wildfires too. The problem of wildfire in Alaska has received a considerable amount of discussion, and the pet question is, should, of course, fires be controlled in Alaska? There's ample evidence that under particular soil conditions and with rains immediately following a fire, large land slumps do occur. We feel these slumps are caused by the effect of fire upon the thermal regime, causing the permafrost to thaw, combined with the weakening of due to the fire effects upon the tundra mantle, and the weight of the surface soil layer succumbs to the influence of gravity and moves on down slope. And of course, when these occur adjacent to streams, there is pollution of that stream through sediment. Another problem with fire is associated with the control practices. Man has intruded upon the land. He's built cabins. He utilizes timber and the animals. He also, and because of this, it becomes necessary to protect these lands from fire, to protect these values. The use of heavy equipment to control fire has, in some instances, accelerated erosion and created large gullies on these fire lines, which are cleared down to mineral soil. These experiences have led the Bureau of Land Management to control and restrict the use of heavy equipment, as well as to develop techniques for rehabilitating these damaged areas. I'd like to say a little bit more about watershed deterioration as it relates to water quality. We're particularly concerned about the conditions of both our commercial and our sports fisheries, and many species that we recognize as being extremely valuable rely upon the gravel beds in either rivers or lakes in which to spawn. The disruption of these spawning grounds by sediments can be extremely damaging to fishers' resource. Some techniques have been developed for rehabilitating the beds of these streams, and these are very expensive, and it's really much cheaper and better to prevent the loss in the first place. Watershed implications extend from the terrestrial zone to the estuarine and coastal areas, and possibly even into the outer continental shelf itself. Nutritive enrichment of these areas is carried through water flows originating from the uplands. Modification of flows in quantity or quality, or by the addition of foreign or toxic substances, can affect the productivity of these areas. Another phenomenon in the Arctic is solifluction. This is a gradual movement of soil and material down slope. It usually occurs very slowly, and the area remains vegetated, and it maintains its hydrologic balance. It occurs where there's permafrost and is quite natural to the subarctic and Arctic areas. I believe that you can readily see what occurs when a road or other construction intersects this where solifluction is part of the natural process. An incision across the slope can result in the unraveling of the cover, resulting in slumpage and movement of the soil both below and above the incised area. This can cause a chain reaction. Materials plug culverts, surface water flows across the road, precipitating erosion. Additional waste materials are created that have to be disposed of, and of course there's increased danger of sediment getting into the streams. It would be possible to explore each type of land use and discuss its impacts upon the watershed. I might mention a few of the more dramatic. Mineral extraction has influenced our natural watersheds in the state. Gold is frequently found at the contact and frozen alluvium at the contact point between the bedrock and frozen alluvium. And much of this alluvium has to be thawed before the gold is removed. This process of thawing and then excavation, of course, has serious implications to watershed conditions. One of the things, of course, that's undergoing review now is the 1872 Mining Act. And recently there was a symposium, week-long symposium here in Anchorage discussing this act. Oil drilling activities depend upon soil stability for structural and mechanical support. Surface disturbance from these same activities can result in thawing of the permafrost, which is followed by subsidence and erosion. Large quantities of gravel are used for roads, for construction pads, for oil wells, and construction camps. Removal of these materials can have an influence on the watershed. You can continue to list the list, including impacts of villages, of various types of rights-of-way, timber harvesting, farming, recreation activities, until you've covered all of the uses of lands. The point here being that before land use decisions are made, it's necessary to understand conditions of a watershed from a hydrologic and soil standpoint to evaluate proposal in consonance with the natural conditions. We must predict the effect that people or activities might have on a watershed, also as type of rehabilitation measures necessary to minimize watershed damage. Some of the mechanism for assuring protection of watershed values pending in Congress is a proposed National Land Use Policy Act, which will provide grants to the states for developing for development and administration of land use plans. These state programs would basically apply to non-federal lands, but would require federal projects to be consistent with the state land use plans, thus requiring coordination between state and federal agencies. It also established criteria for acceptance of state land use programs, including inventory and designation of special areas. Another act pending in Congress currently is an organic act for management of the public lands. This would provide for classification of public lands for various purposes, also law enforcement to enforce use in a proper context. The role of the BLM in the past has generally been one of managing the lands which were not transferred into private ownership or were not identified of having some particular national value and being managed as part of a park or of a refuge system. Because of this, many of the lands that the BLM administers are what in the past have been termed as wastelands. They are extremely susceptible to use because many of these lands are associated with the deserts or low rainfall areas. Currently, BLM's role as a land management agency is a little bit overshadowed by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the process of administering this, also the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. But we would expect our land planning to move forward as land ownership patterns firm up. And one example of this is in the near future, we will be going forward to the public with a land use plan, a proposed land use plan, some information on the pipeline corridor itself for public review and input. We're now anticipating about 14 million acres of native-owned land, 104 million acres of state-owned land, additional lands managed as parks, of refuges, forests, or wild scenic rivers. These ownerships will each assume their own management philosophy, and the coordination of land use plans become much more complicated. The management of adjacent lands become an issue. For example, where a native corporation owns land bordering on a state or national park. If these lands contain mineral wealth and the corporation elects to extract these minerals, or activities can impact, and probably will, upon the management of the adjacent parklands. The logical progression following land use planning is zoning. This is contemplated in the National Land Use Policy Act. This places a heavy burden on the state and local governments and will be difficult and a controversial subject, but very necessary in order to maintain some continuity in land use impacts. I might mention that the very land we're on now is contained within a Recreation and Public Purposes Act patent, and this patent has a sanction within it that this area has to be used for educational purposes. And it was a form of zoning when the patent was issued by the Bureau of Land Management. And of course it means that for a considerable time it doesn't mean it can't be changed, but it means that it's somewhat difficult to change it. That this land in this area, there's approximately a section here, 640 acres, will be dedicated to that type of use. I'd like to summarize by saying that watershed generally constitutes an ecological boundary of significance to the land manager, and its condition should be established and monitored in order to evaluate and assure its future condition, and productivity. In a situation of intermingled land use ownership, there is no alternative other than development of cooperative land management programs.
Thank you. The next speaker.
As Lidia indicated, Mayor Sullivan does come to you this morning disguised as the Public Works Director. Mayor called me yesterday evening, and he has a severe case of the flu, and in his dying breath, he asked if I would represent him here this morning on the panel. Of course, this morning or today is a holiday for city employees. Now, as I accepted eagerly, I told him I was wondering what I was going to do to keep the day from becoming boring, and now I know. I'd like to go into the history of Anchorage's water source development with you. I think what you have heard from the speakers this morning and what you will hear later on in the program about the planning for water sources, land use planning, environmental considerations, all sum up to mean what kind of water you're going to get from your tap as you turn on that faucet. Water supply is a prime determinant in the location of most of our cities in the United States, and certainly Anchorage is no different. Back in 1911, only 2 families lived in the Ship Creek Flats. In 1914, when the first surveyors came in to do the construction work on the Anchorage Railroad, they laid out what is now the city of Anchorage along the banks of Ship Creek, because here was a potable and abundant water supply. In 1917, the Alaska Engineering Commission installed the initial water system for Anchorage, which was purchased in 1920, a short time after incorporation of the city of Anchorage. About that same time, a watershed reserve was established in the watersheds of both Ship Creek and Campbell Creek to protect these watersheds for primarily water use. This reserve has been maintained essentially in that initial form today, with the exception of the encroachment of the Fort Rich and the Elmendorf military reservations. In the early 1940s, because of this encroachment, the city of Anchorage decided to install transmission lines and facilities at points upstream from the areas of development to ensure no pollution of the water source. I think an interesting note from the minutes of the city council meeting at that particular time when those decisions were being made, the minutes reflected concerns about the Peterkin family cows that were in the watershed, and they didn't feel like they were giving proper concern to sanitation and water use. Complete plans, therefore, were prepared to construct and develop a water system in the Campbell Creek area, where, of course, an excellent source of water exists, even better than Ship Creek in the area of purity, especially during spring runoff. However, because of the tremendous Elmendorf growth that was occurring about that time, which certainly would directly affect the growth of the city of Anchorage, the fathers immediately could see that development of the Campbell Creek watershed would not be sufficient to meet the envisioned growth of the city. And therefore, before even proceeding with any plans which were already in progress for development of Campbell Creek, they instructed their consulting engineers to go back and develop the Ship Creek supply. At about that same time also, Elmendorf was constructing an intake on Ship Creek, located approximately a half-mile downstream from where our present intake structure is on Ship Creek. An agreement was signed with Elmendorf that the city of Anchorage might tap this intake structure for our supply. In 1952, the military undertook the construction of a water treatment plant, and a new diversion facility was built on Ship Creek at its present location, where the city of Anchorage also taps the creek for supply to our water treatment facility. And this diversion dam has been used continuously since that time by the military and the city. In the early stages of the city and military water intake, a 75 horsepower steam boiler was installed in the intake area in an attempt to inject live steam into the system to cut down on the possibility of water service and water main freeze up during the winter. This was a program of trying to see whether or not this would have any effect on the system. As some of you may know, back in 1955-56, we had a severe winter freeze up. I think some 3,000 water services were frozen. It resulted in an expense of approximately $63,000 to customers for thawing water service lines. Some $37,000 was expended by the city in thawing water mains. About $100,000 was spent that particular year because of this phenomena unique to Alaska. So for that reason also, councils and those concerned with water supply felt like some type of warming system had to be initiated in the Anchorage area. So a full development of a well system was initiated about this time in order to take advantage of the warmer underground water in the hopes that this would eliminate some of the freezing problems during the winter. The City of Anchorage has recognized the limitations of continually adding wells to the system, however, and therefore we've had several studies undertaken to determine the best and most economical alternates for additional water supplies to meet our growing needs. Following very extensive groundwater studies by the USGS in the 60s that showed that additional groundwater supplies in Anchorage are limited. There isn't a maximum extent to which we can draw upon groundwater. Following the results of this study, the city hired the firm of Trick, Nyman, and Hayes to determine and to prepare a very detailed water source study for the Anchorage Bowl. This study was jointly financed by the city and Central Alaska Utilities on a prorated basis according to customers served. The first task of the study was to determine the current use, of course, of water in the Anchorage area, and then using population and per capita use projections in the various census tracts to determine what the future uses would be. In order to arrive at a recommended plan, in order to give adequate consideration to factors such as reliability, the need for economic and environmental sound solutions, all of the potential sources of Alaska within a 40-mile radius of Anchorage were investigated. This involves some 26 different potential water supply sources. And I know, as all of you do, and me being relatively new to the area, you would think that a good, potable, cheap water supply in Alaska would be at your doorstep. Unfortunately, as we all know, this is not the case in Alaska. I'd like to just go over some of the sources that have been included in this particular study and include most of the major watersheds within the area. The surface supply possibilities along the Little Susitna River was studied, as well as the possibility of injecting or introducing wells in the Little Sioux River Delta. Surface supplies on the Matanuska River and the Connect River were investigated. Sources of surface supply possibilities or dams were also studied in the Eklutna River area, Peters Creek, Eagle River, and as well as the South Fork of the Eagle River. Also, testing was